I'm not certain why, but we human beings seem to be obsessed with measuring. We measure everything. We measure height. We measure weight. We've even tried, though I think it impossible as a former educator, to measure learning. And most of us have heard about the need to measure success. For some reason, we are obsessed with measuring in our world. We also occasionally misunderstand our obsession with measuring. I'm reminded of a story that one of my friend's wives got into, and it's a story he loves to tell on her because it makes her sort of look like one who doesn't understand much less measuring. Johnny says that Janet was getting ready to hang some drapes, and she needed some angle irons on which to hang the drapes. And she went to the hardware store and she found what she was looking for, and she told the man behind the counter who was to cut the angle irons what she wanted, and his question to her was, "How long do you want them?" "Oh, forever," she said. Sometimes, even in our obsession with measuring like Janet, we misunderstand measuring. It's clear that the disciples of Jesus, Peter being their spokesman, but it was likely the whole group of them, had a misunderstanding of the measuring of forgiveness. And in fact, we know from the study of the Midrash of the day that Peter's suggestion that one would forgive someone 7 times, he thought to be quite generous. For most of the rabbis had decided that forgiveness stopped around number 3 or number 4, and after that you could just move on. So Peter thought 7's a good number. I'm almost double the recommended daily allowance, and surely Jesus will approve of that. And yet the number Jesus gives is one that his original hearers understood to be an infinite number. It's not just 77 times or 7 times 7, 7 or 7 times 70, as the story is told about 3 or 4 different times in the Gospels with different sets of numbers. No, Jesus' idea was that any multiple of 7 took one to infinity. And forgiveness was one of those things that ought to be infinite. Forgiveness was one of those things that ought not to be limited. Forgiveness was one of those things in which his disciples would have to engage continuously. And yet they, like we, struggle with forgiveness. They struggle with the idea of forgiving at all, much less forgiving infinitely, and it raises the question with me, why is it that we struggle so much with this idea? Why is it that one who is forgiven a lifetime, or by some accounts several lifetimes of debt, as the man in Jesus' story was, can go and grab one by the throat who only owes him about a couple of days' worth of debt and insist that he be repaid? Why is it that we want mercy for ourselves and justice for everyone else? Why is forgiveness so hard? Well, I don't know all of the answers to that, but I think it's at least the following. Forgiveness is difficult for us because the truth is, when we find ourselves in the place of needing to forgive, it is because we have been offended. It is because we have been hurt. It is because it's hard to let go of that sort of hurt. The inclination of someone who is hurting is to hurt back. The inclination of someone who is owed a debt is to make sure they collect. It is hard to forgive because forgiveness is always precipitated by some sort of offense that creates the need for forgiveness. And yet, Jesus says to us, even though that is hard, you should forgive infinitely. A challenge, no doubt. It is also, I think, hard to forgive because when we forgive, we do have to give up something. We have to give up that sense of hurt, that sense of wrong, that sense of being betrayed, that sense of being owed. And the truth is that some of us, even though it is socially, psychologically, and sometimes even physically harmful to hang on to things like that, some of us would rather hang on to that hurt than let go of it. Some of us would rather hang on to that hurt than release it. Some of us would rather hang on to that hurt than to trust the goodness of God, that forgiveness is what is really better for us. Forgiveness is hard because not only have we been offended, but we have to give up something when we acknowledge that offense and we offer forgiveness to that other person. And yet Jesus says that is something that, as hard as it is, we must seek to do infinitely if we're going to follow His path. Forgiveness, I think, is also hard because there's no guarantee in forgiveness that the offense or the debt that we are asked to forgive won't happen again. There's no guarantee that we'll never be hurt again. There's no guarantee that we'll never be owed again. There's no guarantee that anything that we do will revolutionize the world in any way that makes much difference. And yet, Jesus says we are to forgive infinitely because even without the guarantee, the only way our world is ever going to work is when it's based on a system of infinite forgiveness. If we all go around holding our hurts and holding our debts and insisting that they must all be satisfied in our own minds, then we'll never find the path to peace that we seek. We'll never find the way of Jesus to be our way. We'll never be able to walk with Him in the way that He calls us to walk. Yes, forgiveness is hard because forgiveness brings with it no guarantee that hurt or debt won't happen again. Jesus' disciples greatly misunderstood the idea of forgiveness. Their understanding of how one measured forgiveness was almost as bad as my friend Janet's understanding of the measuring of angle irons. And yet Jesus' call to infinite forgiveness is a call to us to be vulnerable, to risk the possibility that forgiveness is the better way, to risk the possibility that a restored relationship is always better than a fractured relationship, to risk the possibility that if we take the first step, we might in fact be able to complete the puzzle that will bring others back into fellowship with us. Jesus' call to infinite forgiveness is also a call to let go. To let go of all of those things that we feel the need to keep track of, and in our keeping track of them, we obsess ourselves and weigh ourselves down with anger and hatred and bitterness that can never do us any good. So Jesus calls us to infinite forgiveness so that we can let go of those things. Jesus' call to infinite forgiveness is also a call to believe in the better possibilities of those with whom we share the world. Now, that doesn't mean that they will act better, But if we could at least believe that the possibility is there, it may change our mindset and make us more healthy and make us more functional in the world in which we live. I often say to couples in marriage counseling, on the crisis end of things, always assume the best about your partner, even if it's not true. Because if you assume the best, that will help your mindset. If you start with the assumption of the worst, your mindset's going to be awful to begin with. Always assume the best. Jesus' call to forgiveness was the opportunity to believe that there are better possibilities among those who have offended us. There are better possibilities among those who owe us. There are better possibilities in our world than we have experienced, and our ability to see and understand that may begin with this call to infinite forgiveness. Jesus' call to forgiveness is also there because forgiveness is essential to Christian community. There is no community that has ever existed that hasn't existed without pain and hurt and offense and debt. And the only way that the community is ever able to heal and move forward is when someone in the community can help it to forgive all of those things. Jesus' call to forgiveness is a reminder to us that forgiveness is not so much a transactional act as it is an attitude of life. And if we can take on the attitude of being forgiving, being humble, being willing to bear with others, then we can help to create a better community. We can help to create a better world. We can make possible the things that will not be possible without that sense of infinite forgiveness. We've all been in the place of that person who owed 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 lifetimes of debt. And we've all had to seek forgiveness as he did. And we've all been in the place of that one who was being held accountable for just a little bit of debt. And chances are, if we can remember how we felt in each of those places, we would admit to ourselves that it felt a lot better to be forgiven than it did to be held accountable. And if that is the case for us, that certainly must also be the case for those with whom we share life. Jesus said, "Forgive infinitely." Believe the best about all of those around you. Seek to make the world a more peaceful place through the act of letting go. May God give us the grace to be forgiving people. May God give us the wisdom to understand that forgiveness is always the better path. And may God give us the courage to act when we have the opportunity to forgive another. Amen.